Okay, so I know we have finished talking about agriculture in class, but I promised you guys some Green Revolution notes, so here they are. So before we get into the Green Revolution, let's talk about how farming was traditionally done. There has been some evidence of like some small scale farming and agriculture of some of the kind of edible grasses like wheat or um some of the other things on this list. There's a couple of kinds of wheat on here. There's barley. And so there's some evidence of that in the Middle East as long ago as 21,000 BCE. By the way, BCE stands for before Common Era. It replaces BC, which is based on Christianity. I believe the changing from BC to BCE and changing from AD, which literally means in the year of our Lord, to CE is like a kind of a more diversity inclusive way of doing dating. And so you'll notice I use that notation. So then at about 9500 BC, some of the kind of eight earliest crops started to be cultivated in that same area. And so that's where you started having agriculture. And then what you see here on the bottom, this is from a ancient Egyptian burial chamber. So you'll notice they have animals. They're pulling a plow, and that plow is going to kind of dig furrows into the earth, so dig kind of trenches. And that's how they turned over the soil, as well as they would be able to go behind the plow, and they would be able to plant seeds. Then in 5700 BC, you start seeing rice cultivation in China. In 4000 BCE, you start seeing wooden plows being used in the Middle East. And in 3500 BCE, there's evidence of irrigation. Now, keep in mind, this is all thousands of years ago, so there is limited machinery. So a lot of this is done by manual labor or by using animals. So it's not like you're going to be, clearing like half of a continent. Usually most of this was small plots of land. Um, People were growing mostly for subsistence farming and then maybe giving a little bit in taxes to a lord or king or someone like that. And then in the 1940s to 1970s, you started having a change. So before this, there was there were some countries that were starting to use some different techniques for agriculture, but until the 40s to 70s, when this green revolution happened, you didn't really see a lot of that technology being shared. And then you still had a lot of throughout the world small farms that were run by families, a lot of subsistence farming. Then the Green Revolution happened, and this was kind of driven by a lot of the technological innovations and, uh, you know, population boom that happened after World War II. So some of these techniques had been used in industrialized nations, but in during the Green Revolution, this was really spread to a lot of developing countries, pre-industrialized nations. So it relied on a few things. Mechanization, meaning using machines more than using people or animals, having specific breeds of grains like dwarf wheat and dwarf rice, which would have higher yield or produce more food per acre, and also had a wider variety of conditions they could grow in. They grew faster. Unfortunately, these varieties relied on heavy fertilizer input. So that was another kind of strategy of the Green Revolution, as well as expanding the infrastructure or the structures that you had in place to help with irrigation, as well as widespread use of synthetic pesticides. So we're going to talk about each of these in detail. Um, Old school farming, you could honestly do with like, get a plow, get an animal, maybe get a hoe, the garden tool so that you could dig out weeds, and a lot of the rest of it was done by hand. You might have some farm animals that can help out with some of it, but other than that, it was a lot of manual labor, hard work, um, and you'd have to pay whoever was working on your farm. So Then, with, tanks, cars, all of that technology being really built up during World War II, people started to take that technology and utilize it for farming. So, a lot of the farming that's done nowadays is done on a more industrial scale, where it's not small family plots of land. It is, corporation owned, very large farms, and they are very heavily reliant on mechanization using tractors, mechanical harvesters, sprayers, seeding machines that can actually plant for you, earth moving equipment to help you with irrigation, um, and like tractors to help you turn over soil to prepare fields for the next season. And so these things became very prevalent. Unfortunately, they're also expensive. So that's one of the reasons why people started, combining farms. Like companies would start owning farms more so than families. But there were benefits. You could increase your profits and you could increase your efficiency. In countries where agricultural workers tend to get higher wages, the farms rely on mechanization quite a bit more because it's cheaper to run the machine than to pay the workers. Unfortunately, to run the machine, you need diesel or gas and you need fossil fuels. So it's really increased our reliance on fossil fuels, and it's also increased the use of monoculture, which I've talked about several times. So genetically modified organisms, when we hear that, we tend to think of, playing with genes, inserting genes, doing some Frankenstein stuff in a laboratory. But the original plant varieties that were developed that became important to the Green Revolution were actually bred just old school, like the type of breeding that we've been doing to domesticate plants and animals, throughout all of human history. So there were a couple of varieties of dwarf plants that would basically grow shorter than normal plants. And because of that, they had a few things. They had a stronger stalk, and since they didn't need to grow as tall, they weren't wasting as much energy. And I call this wasting, but that's, for when we're trying to grow food, to grow to a tall height. They would also not need as much time to grow because they would reach a shorter height and then start fruiting. So this is two varieties of wheat. This is the original strain that most people were growing pre-Green Revolution, and this is the dwarf strain that really became widespread. So notice a few things. It's shorter, meaning it's going to take less time to grow. Another thing, if you look at it, it's got a lot more grain per stalk than the original wheat. So you could plant fewer plants and get the same amount of grain. This shorter stalk was also kind of stronger and tougher, which meant that it was easier for the stuff to be harvested by machine. So that way, that increased the ability to mechanize. And then some of these varieties would even be more resistant to specific plant pathogens. So it was not just developing these varieties; it was spreading their use throughout the planet. So this started out in Mexico, and they started using these dwarf varieties and doing everything else from the Green Revolution and had massive success with increasing crop yields. And so then it spread from there to other countries that were having trouble producing enough food to feed their populations, like India and Pakistan. Apologies, I forgot to put my phone on silent. So, fertilizer was also something that was heavily applied or became a bigger practice. Before the Green Revolution, most fertilizer was things like manure, could be compost, so food waste and stuff like that, and, like plant waste. You harvest your plants, and then the part that you don't eat, that could end up becoming fertilizer. Um, But the thing is, it kind of, limits you. You've got to have something that produces manure. if you're needing more fertilizer, more nutrients for these high yield varieties that were developed, these dwarf plants, then, the plant waste from the previous season may not be enough to provide the nutrients. So, what ended up happening is in the late 1800s, chemists started developing these techniques where they were able to take nitrogen gas and they were able to make the kind of nitrogen that organisms can absorb. So remember, there's only one organism on the planet that can take nitrogen gas and make organic nitrogen, and that is nitrogen fixing bacteria. So now, instead of having nitrogen fixing bacteria, we were able to, build a factory and use that to create organic nitrogen from the air, pretty much. And so that allowed an increase in the use of synthetic fertilizer. Synthetic fertilizer usually contains nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are the most common elements that are found. They're not like straight elements, they're, like ammonia or phosphates, things like that. Now, this graph is showing an estimate of what the world population is, and believe this data is ultimately not from 2015, so it was projecting. And then it shows you what's the population that be able to be supported without having synthetic fertilizer. So notice that without synthetic fertilizer, only about half the population of the planet would be able to exist. About half the world's population is only able to live because synthetic fertilizer increased our food yield. So, when we talked in Unit 3 about population and how the human population has exploded exponentially, a lot of that was allowed by the increase in crop production during the Green Revolution. So another technique is increasing infrastructure for irrigation. So before the Green Revolution, you still had people who were irrigating their fields. They would dig channels, dig canals to bring water from wherever their surface water to their fields. But you still had to be relatively close to some surface water or be in an area with lots of precipitation. However, with large earth moving equipment, bulldozer, things like that, you could dig deeper channels. You could start making canals, which would carry water. Nowadays, you can carry water in open canals or channels. You can also pipe it to your fields, and that allows not only to have more land be usable for agriculture, but also increased crop yields. So this graph is just showing you the kind of and I made sure to find one from about the beginning of the Green Revolution to later on. And you can see this is in the United States, but it's showing you an increase in the amount of water that's being used for irrigation. So we were starting to use some areas that were not originally good for agriculture. They were just too dry. Pesticides also increased in use. So, unfortunately, during World War I and World War II, countries were doing research into using chemical warfare, so chemicals to attack soldiers. And after the war, they were like, hey, this stuff kills humans. Maybe it'll kill insects too. And so some of these synthetic pesticides have their origin in chemical research during World War II. But after World War II, we started really trying to produce these synthetic pesticides in large amounts. Um, and so this is showing in U.S. agriculture the increase in the use of these pesticides from 1960 all the way through like the 80s. And so this would decrease the destruction of crops by pests. You wouldn't have insects or rodents or anything eating all your plants. You wouldn't have all these weeds that would be taking up the nutrients and the fertilizer that you put on your crops. And so it increased productivity dramatically. We've also had our pesticides lesson, so that tells you if you need to look at what were the environmental consequences of increased pesticide use, go back and watch those videos. So, the benefits of the Green Revolution were quite obviously the fact that a lot of people were able to survive. It averted famine for billions of people on the planet, and we were able to support a larger population. It also led to some reduction in poverty, increased income, and we were able to grow the same amount of food on less land. So, we haven't cleared as much land as we otherwise would have to be able to support the current population. Similarly, a decrease in infant mortality. All of that's great, right? Well, as we'll see, there's always some negative consequences. So, what were some of the consequences of the Green Revolution? Well, one thing is that increased mechanization means that modern day farms are heavily, heavily reliant on fossil fuels. So, here we see energy consumption for US farms in 2012. Notice that the distillate fuel, that would be like diesel and gas, you're also using some electricity, propane, natural gas, and those are all going to be fossil fuels that are contributing to CO2 levels in the atmosphere. Same thing with livestock production, which we'll have in our one of our coming sets of notes. And so, another byproduct of the green revolution is some of these fertilizers and pesticides that we use, they're actually either produced from crude oil or we have to use a lot of power to make them. So all of that adds to kind of the carbon footprint of modern farms. There were also some socioeconomic effects. So, for example, people used to be doing subsistence uh, farming. They were growing food to feed themselves. However, with the expansion and the ability to grow these high yield crops, some countries, instead of focusing on, oh, okay, make sure you're able to feed your family in the surrounding area, instead of that, they started going towards, hey, let's produce grain for export or to feed animals. So, an example of this is in the Green Revolution, there were these plants of a type called pulses that a lot of Indian peasants used to eat. But then, after the Green Revolution, a lot of that land, instead of being used to grow food for the people who were growing it, was instead used to grow wheat for export. Another thing is smaller family-run farms weren't able to compete with large commercial farms, and so some family farmers who'd been farming for generations on land ended up losing their farms because they just couldn't compete. Modern day agriculture is really expensive, so a lot of those farms were replaced by larger commercial farms. There will be another video talking about the impacts of agriculture that will go into more detail.